Hello, everyone. My name is Elise Higgs, and today I'm going to discuss how international law and the international community combats the prevalence of torture. I decided to focus on this global issue because most people do not think of regular state practices, such as capital punishment or solitary confinement, as constituting torture. However, torture remains a regular occurrence in both developing and developed countries, often through punitive measures executed by criminal justice systems. According to Amnesty International, while torture is outlawed, it occurs in at least 3/4 of the world. While the codified rights are practiced in principle, they are not protected in practice. So, how does the international community combat torture? It is important to note that the international community involves a plethora of state and non-state actors with competing interests, competing norms, and competing values. However, the collective action of state and non-state actors, such as IGOs and NGOs, often demonstrate collaboration, cooperation to address issues that cannot be mitigated by one state or one organization alone. So, what does the law say about torture? International human rights law, including multilateral treaties, prohibits torture under all circumstances. It is outlawed by the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the 1984 Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, and Degrading Punishment. According to this treaty, torture is defined as any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as obtaining information or confession. There are currently 173 parties to this treaty, which entered into force in 1987. And in 1994, the US ratified this convention, however, with several reservations. Now, how does international or intergovernmental organizations help address this issue? Several IGOs, such as the UN Committee Against Torture, the International Justice Resource Center, and the World Organization Against Torture, have instituted reporting and enforcement mechanisms in order to abolish torture. IGOs recognize that there are challenges to solving this issue. For example, states may make reservations, as previously mentioned, to the treaties if certain provisions of it do not necessarily coincide with their national interest. This may include military operations. For example, the war on terror is often used as a justification for torturing alleged terrorists. IGOs cannot address this issue on their own, so we must look to what human rights scholars have to say. Legal scholars find that the absolute prohibition of torture is not an attainable goal for the international community, especially as global superpowers and continue to violate these set of laws, and set precedent that torture is justified in order to punish criminals. An interesting quote from Juan Mendez, a professor of human rights law, is as follows: "If everything is torture, then nothing is torture." Scholars recommend narrowing and refining the definition so that torture is easily identifiable and can be prosecuted in a court of law. Torture is essentially ineffective in terms of accomplishing goals of extracting information, and the treatment of criminals does not serve its intended purpose. In fact, it often produces counteractive results. Another important actor in addressing torture is NGOs, or non-governmental organizations, such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. These organizations actively advocate for the abolition of torture. They campaign for the adoption, implementation of independent checks on detention centers in several countries, monitoring of interrogation processes, and investigations on allegations of torture at the hands of the state. So, why does any of this matter? Well, the first step to solving a problem is to acknowledge that a problem exists in the first place. As members of the global community, as world citizens, we have an obligation, a moral obligation, a legal obligation to acknowledge and address the prevalence of torture, especially committed by state actors who are supposed to protect its people, especially those that are in high positions of power. By educating ourselves on international human rights law and the efforts of organizations, while taking into account the considerations of human rights scholars, we become one step closer to addressing the unjustified suffering of millions of people across the globe. Thank you.